The following program is a public access production of the Cayuga Museum of History and Art and Case Research Lab, who assumes full responsibility for its content. The content of this program does not represent the views of Auburn Regional Media Access, which serves as a forum for community expression and offers TV training, production facilities, and channel time to all Auburn area residents and organizations.
All right, so to introduce our first speaker, so this event will begin with a traditional opening, which will be given by Stephen Henhawk, who is a Gayogohó language teacher, faithkeeper, and historian from the Six Nations Reserve in Ontario, Canada. Henhawk currently works in the Gayogohó homeland as a research associate at Cornell University. His work has centered on language revitalization, ceremonial preservation, and correcting and supplementing academic, public, and community understandings of Haudenosaunee history. Stephen will also be giving a presentation at this program.
Curator. Ne na ton howe na ton wendade. Ne Gayogohó. Ne di. And gane na dwadi na great can. Sweet gay ha. O na ye, what need to doggies? Quas on go dra sweet. Ne na gane one. Sa guayon. Na ton howe na ton wendade. Ne gi sweet gay ha. Quaski ha de yo na da wene na ne Gayogohó na ton howe. O na what need to doggies? Quas de gotcha. Quaski ha de yo na hadi no. Ton da wene na ton howe. Quas de gotcha. Ne wando gwa na hangyo na ton howe. Ne di na gane na hagata na Gayogohó ya. Ne ga ya no ga ni ga go. Ne na ton howe na Gayogohó. Scott de knie. Ase ge huis. He only. He ni ga go na Gayogohó ne na ton howe. Aso guas on go dra suyo. Gawena de ni ya. I'll turn my words around to English, to speak English. The first thing that I had spoken, what I had spoken here was I had spoke and I had said that I'm going to speak the language that this land understands. Because when we speak English here in these lands, this land is the lands of the Gayogohó. English has only been spoken here for 200 and something years. Gayogohó has been spoken here for 13,000 years. So when I spoke, what I spoke to the first thing was Ganȯ, our mother, where we all walked on. Every one of us, we walked here. We were able to walk on our mother, Ganȯ. Why is it important for me to share and to speak that language to Ganȯ, to our mother, to everything here is because this land, it doesn't understand English. And if the more that the land hears the English, I feel that it's being confused. It's been confused. So whenever I get the chance here to when I'm here in my homelands. This is why language is so important. This is why I use language, is because I use that to remind this land here, the lands of it. I went further on. I talked about that our people, that we're lucky. We view ourselves as lucky, as that we're a lucky people, that we're able to be here. I count it in this room here. I count it that we're lucky. That there's 6 of us in this room. That's hօnyŭhk, that are the original people of this. I had spoken of, prior to this, it would have been the other way around. To where, right here where we are, this place, that there would have been all kinds of hօnyŭhk people that was able to travel here. But things are different today. We're going to have a chance to listen to some experts up to talk about this. In this program, I know in this program that it had been given that I was going to say the Ganŭ hŭnyŭhk, that I was going to say this idea. That's not what's happening. Because that's reserved for our own people. That's reserved for an event where it's going to be brought together. What we're talking about here, I know that there wasn't no Ganŭ hŭnyŭhk put through at these treaty events. So that's why I chose to not to do Ganŭ hŭnyŭhk, to do that, because it's reserved for other events. But what I chose to do was to talk a little bit about our people, to tell you a little bit about it, and to talk to the land here in the language that it understands. Yahweh, Eswanatondot. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. Thank you. All right, so I'll just kind of read the bios to introduce our other 2 speakers, and then we can invite Peter up to get started with the program. Peter Whiteley is Curator of North American Ethnology at the American Museum of Natural History and a professor in its Richard Gilder Graduate School. An anthropologist specializing in Hopi history and culture, he has published widely on the subject. In 1999, he was commissioned by the U.S. Department of Justice to research Gayogohó history in connection with a land claim involving the Cayuga Nation. His findings informed expert testimony in federal court and subsequent publications. Whiteley continues his research on Cayuga history, including the impacts of the Revolutionary War and diaspora. Kurt A. Jordan is professor of anthropology and American Indian and Indigenous Studies at Cornell University. His research concentrates on the long-term archaeology and history of indigenous communities in the Finger Lakes region of New York State, with particular emphasis on the 17th and 18th centuries. His publications include The Seneca Restoration, an Iroquois Local Political Economy from 2008, and The Gayogohó People in the Cayuga Lake Region, A Brief History from 2022. Thank you.
Is my microphone working? Yeah. Okay, great. All right. Well, thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you very much for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here. Just wanted to point out a couple of things for orientation to begin with, because these will be issues that come up later. This is the Cayuga Residence Reservation, so-called, established in 1795 as a result of the treaty. This is Great Gully, up and down, and you can see there are some Cayuga houses on both sides of it in this particular depiction. This is the so-called Ganȯga Reservation, which is where Red Jacket was born and Fish Carrier was associated especially. That's a name that'll come back. And here is by John Harris's allotment is his house and where the ferry began, and that's where the Treaty of Cayuga Ferry was held in July 1795. Next slide, please. So the Cayugas, of course, were a key member of the Confederacy or League of the Iroquois, comprising 5 nations and 6 after 1722 when the Tuscaroras joined. There was an intricate structure of governance, of interlinked clans and nations presided over by a council of 50 titled so-called sachems, or hodiaineso. Stephen's going to be correcting me as I go along, of which the Cayugas accounted for 10 of that 50. As Schoolcraft put it in 1845, in all that constituted national action, they were a pure republic, and this was something that was described also by French authors throughout that period. Called the Romans of the New World, the Haudenosaunee League dominated eastern North America from the coast to the Mississippi and from the St. Lawrence to the Gulf of Mexico for the better part of 2 centuries, until, that is, the Revolutionary War. Next slide, please. This was done both through diplomacy, in the passing of words that was certified and remembered on wampum, belts and strings and so forth, among other things. Next slide. And also through war. But in any event, the Haudenosaunee League was a very powerful entity, and they played off the French and the British against each other for a good long time. Next slide, please. So in the earlier 17th century and still up to the Revolutionary War, this depiction by Lewis Henry Morgan shows Cayuga territory right here going all the way north from Cayuga Lake up to Lake Ontario and all the way south down to the Pennsylvania line. Of course, it continued, but this is only about New York. So this is an area of about 1,600 square miles. And from that, the reservation itself would be carved out. Next slide, please. Alliances between the colonists and the Haudenosaunee were brokered especially by the British through the so-called covenant chain, a long-term pattern of allegiances instituted in the 17th century, but certainly continued, especially with the Mohawks via Sir William Johnson in the 1750s during the French and Indian War, which was, a significant prelude to the Revolutionary War. The French and Indian, or the 7 Years' War, as it was called in Europe, was what Winston Churchill called the First World War. Next slide, please. And for the French, those alliances were operated especially via the Jesuit missions, again until after the close of the French and Indian War. Here, the new mission of La Présentation Oswegatchie, that attracted especially Onondagas and Cayugas, founded in 1850, is shown in this 1750 in the 1750 map. And here you'll see Haudenosaunee longhouses right next to the fort itself. Next slide, please. After the war, under a royal proclamation of 1763, confirmed in 1768 at Fort Stanwix, modern Rome, New York, Sir William Johnson established a boundary between the colonies and native lands in eastern North America. Haudenosaunee rights were thus recognized west of the line of property. You can see that Cayuga lands were totally encompassed by that recognition. When New York drew up its state constitution in 1777, that line was again explicitly acknowledged, recognizing Cayuga sovereignty over their lands. Next slide, please. Despite uniform Haudenosaunee resistance to joining either side during the Revolutionary War, the long covenant chain between the Crown and the Six Nations was exploited, with the Mohawk Valley Mohawks eventually declaring for the king, joined principally by Senecas, Onondagas, and Cayugas, and that so-called loyalist group was epitomized by Joseph Brant, a Mohawk captain in the British Army and brother-in-law of William Johnson. The principal leader of the Cayugas during this period was Okenjongerte, or Ojarete, whose name was translated then as fish carrier, who was a mentor to Joseph Brant and also to the Seneca leader Farmer's Brother and to the orator Red Jacket. The so-called Loyalist Iroquois were very effective fighters out of Fort Niagara, devastating the Wyoming Valley and the Mohawk River towns in a series of campaigns led by Walter Butler, the son of the Fort Niagara commandant, John Butler. Next slide, please. On the other side, Samuel Kirkland, a Presbyterian missionary to the Oneidas and Tuscaroras, persuaded them to fight with the Patriots. Next slide, please. They did so throughout the war, including John Skenandoah and Good Peter and Louis Cook from Ganawagi, and all three gained special commissions from in the Continental Army. These three appeared at several treaties involving the Cayugas after the war as witnesses and facilitators, and their names appear on several treaties. But the Haudenosaunee Confederacy was in many ways broken apart as the effect of this Revolutionary War pressure from both the British and the Americans. Next slide, please. Despite being treated subsequent to the war, especially as only having loyalist sympathies, the Cayugas were in fact divided, and there were divisions among all of the others of the Six Nations. So in this particular note, about a month before the Sullivan campaign reached Cayuga country, an Onondaga friend, this is speaking in Albany, on his way to the Seneca country, stopped at the Cayuga, whose Tegute Lawana, one of the Cayuga chiefs, told him he had some things to tell him on his return. That accordingly, on his return, the Onondaga delegate called upon the said Cayuga chief, who informed him that it was difficult for them, the one half of the tribe being for America and the other half for the king. Next slide, please. But in fall 1779, in a scorched earth policy approved by both New York Governor George Clinton and by General George Washington, Generals John Sullivan and James Clinton, George Clinton's brother, that is, devastated Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca villages. Next slide, please. Many Cayugas fled to Fort Niagara and later established a settlement along Buffalo Creek. Others hid out in Great Gully, according to Cayugas I have spoken with, and remained in their homeland and were later rejoined by some of those who had fled to Buffalo Creek. But all the Cayuga villages around the lake were destroyed by the campaign. Next slide, please. Still in 1783, at the end of the war, the status of lands remained legally acknowledged as Haudenosaunee per the 1768 Treaty of Fort Stanwix, as shown on this 1776 map. The 1783 Treaty of Paris, ending the Revolutionary War, made no provision for the Six Nations. Therefore, the Continental Congress sought to broker a peace treaty in 1784 at Fort Stanwix. The new state of New York resisted and arranged its own treaties with individual nations, not wanting to have a treaty with the Confederacy as a whole, and leapfrogged ahead of the Congressional Treaty at Fort Stanwix. Governor Clinton, quote, positively stipulating that no long congressional treatment be entered into with Indians residing within the jurisdiction of this state, with whom only I mean to treat, unquote. New York wanted to drive out all Haudenosaunee who had fought with the Loyalists and to then move the Oneidas and Tuscaroras to Seneca country. After the state treaty, Clinton left instructions for two state commissioners, Peter Reichman and Peter Schuyler. Peter Schuyler was General Philip Schuyler's nephew. Both those names will come back to us, all three actually. Philip Schuyler was the leading commissioner of the 1795 Cayuga Ferry Treaty. Clinton left instructions for both those two to remain and try to undermine the Congressional Treaty. But the Congressional Treaty recognized Haudenosaunee rights. Quote, they shall be secured in the peaceful possession of the lands they inhabit, east of the mouth of Buffalo Creek and north of the Pennsylvania line. Next slide, please. In 1787, speculators attached to the state and who had participated directly in the state's 1784 treaty, John Livingston, Peter Reichman, Peter Schuyler, and others, sought to obtain a 999-year lease from the Six Nations to all Haudenosaunee lands in western New York. Joseph Brant, Fish Carrier, Red Jacket, and Louis Cook were all involved, led to believe that Livingston and the others were acting as official state representatives, which was hardly an unreasonable position given that Abraham Cuyler, the leading state commissioner of Indian Affairs in 1787, was a member of this party. It was referred to as the Genesee Company of Adventurers, and they wanted eventually to form a new state because they didn't like how things were going with New York. Next slide, please. And that's because the state refused to accept the lease. But at the same time, oddly enough, they moved to try to purchase Cayuga lands on very similar monetary terms that Livingston had established. Cayugas who were resident at the lake under the leadership of Karistagaya Steel Trap protested that the lease took away their homes. So they negotiated for a reservation at the Treaty of Albany on February 25th, 1789, in which they ceded the majority of their lands, 1,500 square miles, to retain 100 square miles at the north end of the lake. However, immediately after the treaty, within 2 days of the treaty being signed, New York drew up military tract allotments all around the reservation, and marked by the squares, and many of these were apportioned to Sullivan campaign veterans who were, as you can imagine, hardly particularly friendly to those Cayugas who chose to remain. Next slide, please. No one was happy with the reservation. Steel Trap, who had signed the treaty and so forth, nonetheless, when the surveyors came, especially Moses DeWitt, who was working with Simeon DeWitt. I've forgotten the relationship. I think they were brothers, but they may have been cousins. Simeon DeWitt was the Surveyor General for the state of New York through this period. Steel Trap delivered a long speech with 4 strings of wampum, the purport of which was that he had always understood their reservation extended 3 miles wide all the way around the lake, that he wished us to stop with our business until he had an opportunity of talking with his friends from Buffalo Creek, as he understood they were dissatisfied with the sale made to the governor. And he repeated this on several previous occasions, and others repeated it too. So it sounds like they had been misled into believing what the actual dimensions of the reservation were. Fish Carrier came. He was not happy with it either, and ordered the surveyors off the land. Several letters were sent by Joseph Brant to Governor Clinton on Fish Carrier's behalf. Next slide, please. But the treaty was indeed signed, and its signatories included Steel Trap and several others, one of whom I think, hŭnyŭhk, I think that is Gayogo, who had an English name of Captain Key. He will reappear later. That Gayogo is the first Cayuga chief in the roll call of 10 chiefs that represent the whole Confederacy. And there were others that I've mentioned before. This guy, Kedel, that is Good Peter from Oneida. This, John Shenandoah. And here is Louis Cook. Oh, there he is. So the Cayuga Reservation was established. Next slide, please. But to try to make it ratified with the larger Cayuga body, in 1790, the Buffalo Creek Cayugas were invited to a treaty at Fort Stanwix to confirm this 1789 treaty in exchange for annuities. Fish Carrier led the delegation, but he indicated that they thought the reservation lands were already gone. Their homeland was already gone. If my cousin Steel Trap chooses to continue there, well, let him remain. But it's our judgment that it will not be his own, for we do not consider the reserve as our own. Next slide, please. They signed this treaty in 1790, which confirmed the 1789 treaty. Then the Buffalo Creek majority, including Fish Carrier up here, and numerous other folks there. You can see some of the witnesses below as well. So it was now clear that the two factions had been created, and this was a division the governor sought to exploit. Those under Steel Trap who wanted to remain at the lake, and those under Fish Carrier who wanted to remain at Buffalo Creek or at Grand River, lands assigned the Six Nations Loyalists by Lord Haldimand after the war. Those at the reservation were increasingly surrounded by settlers claiming the Livingston lease as the authorization for them to negotiate their own subleases, especially a man named John Richardson, who entered a 21-year lease with Fish Carrier for the whole Cayuga Reservation in 1791. This was denied, sort of, by the state. Next slide, please. Meanwhile, Fish Carrier, Joseph Brant, and others helped George Washington try to establish peace with insurgent nations in Ohio, especially the Miamis. To recognize this, in Philadelphia in 1792, Fish Carrier, as well as several others, were given peace medals to recognize the work that he'd done on behalf of the U.S. Next slide, please, by George Washington. There are no images that I know of Fish Carrier. I have a dispute with the current museum installation, because there is an image that they can, I don't think so. But anyway, there are no images that I know of, but this is his grandson who carried the name forward. It's clear from the record that Fish Carrier was a principal leader at Buffalo Creek, not only for Cayugas, but also Senecas and Onondagas present there too. Thomas Proctor in 1791 had gone to Buffalo Creek for George Washington to try and persuade them at that point to go to Ohio to try and prevent the war that was bubbling up there too. And Proctor characterized Fish Carrier this way: as the right-hand man of Joseph Brant and John Butler, his physiognomy when speaking put me in remembrance of the old Roman senators, possessing so much keen gravity in his manner. I think his grandson conveys some of that too, so I think it's still appropriate to show that image here. Next slide, please. But the state of lands remained unclear, however. New York's treaties contested the sovereign right of the federal government, which was stipulated by the Constitution that New York had signed in 1788, to negotiate all land cessions with native nations. That was a congressional privilege. It wasn't something that each state had legally authorized to it. The line of property is still shown here in yellow. Again, still encompassing there it goes. Still encompassing all of the Cayuga Lake area. Next slide, please. In 1790, Timothy Pickering, who'd been Adjutant General and Quartermaster General in the Continental Army, was appointed by George Washington as Special Commissioner to the Six Nations. He negotiated a treaty at Newtown Point in 1791 with Fish Carrier and others. This was directly precedent to the Treaty of Canandaigua in November 1794. Next slide, please. Although they were in violation of federal law, New York's treaties of 1789 and 1790 with the Cayugas, as well as other treaties, similar treaties with the Onondagas and Oneidas, were ratified by Pickering at Canandaigua. Thus, the federal government recognized the legality of the 1789 Cayuga Reservation. Next slide, please. Cayugas from both sides signed the Canandaigua Treaty. For the lake residents, Captain Key, who held the principal sachem title of hõnyȯhk, wonders of the 10 assigned to the Cayuga, and Fish Carrier, and others, of course, for the Buffalo Creek Cayugas. Farmer's Brother, Red Jacket, Handsome Lake, and Corn Planter, famous Seneca names, and others signed for the Senecas. In response to and in defiance of this Treaty of Canandaigua, the state immediately moved to purchase the Cayuga Reservation, as well as the Onondaga and Oneida reservations, leaving only a 2-square-mile plot for the Cayuga residents. Pickering, now Secretary of War, sought the opinion of Attorney General William Bradford, who affirmed this would be illegal under the 1793 Trade and Intercourse Law, as well as the Constitution itself, so Pickering sought to have it prevented. Next slide, please. Governor Clinton refused to listen to Pickering's protestations, however, and 4 commissioners were appointed, including Philip Schuyler, the Revolutionary War general, and John Richardson, who had remained living on the reservation since first arriving under the Livingston lease in 1788 or 1799. Captain Key, hŭnyŭhk, successor to Steel Trap as leader of the Cayuga Lake minority, Steel Trap had passed away in December 1793 or January 1794, spoke against the stale, and his speech aptly characterizes Cayuga sentiments in general, I think. He said this, that 6 years ago, when the state stole their lands, a few of us met at Albany and you wanted to purchase our lands. We wanted to refer you to our uncles at Buffalo Creek, but you would not. We said they should be consulted, but the bargain was closed and it was not a good one. The reservation was too small, again echoing Steel Trap's point about it going 3 miles all the way around the lake. You thought it enough for us being children. You cheated us in the survey. The surveyor thinks he's a great man, but he's a great cheat, and so on. Little Chief, or Hanging Face, as he was called by the white negotiators, served as the spokesperson for Fish Carrier and the Buffalo Creek majority. And they first asked for a 22-year lease, not too dissimilar from what Richardson had already negotiated 4 years before. But Philip Schuyler refused, indicating they had only come to purchase the lands. Next slide, please. Eventually, the treaty was drawn up. This is Fish Carrier's copy that's in the Canadian National Archives. Next slide, please. And signed. And it's difficult to read these names, but they included, where was I? The Gayogo, Captain Key, and also, I'll get the Fish Carrier down here. Next slide, please. This is a transcription in the Canadian National Archives. The signatories included those that I mentioned for the residents at Cayuga Lake and also for the Cayuga majority at Buffalo Creek. Red Jacket signed as a witness. New York ratified the treaty in 1796, but the United States never did, in keeping with Secretary of War Pickering's view that it was illegal. And U.S. District Judge Neil McCurran determined in the 1990s that it remained illegal under the Trade and Intercourse Laws of 1793. After the treaty, the Cayugas dispersed, a few remaining on the 2-mile square residence reservation for a year or two, but had mostly left by 1800. In 1807, the state treated for the residence reservation, Red Jacket again present as a witness. The Cayugas moved away to Buffalo Creek and Cattaraugus to Grand River and others to Ohio, the latter eventually moving to Kansas, or so-called Indian Territory, in the 1840s. Next slide, please. And that's all I have. Thank you.
I'm not sure. Oh, it's on. Very much on. Yeah, thanks very much. Okay, so I'm going to offer a slightly different version or account of the same time period that Peter was talking about. I'm going to focus less on sort of legal events and diplomacy and more on what the lives of Gayogohó people, and to a little degree also the settlers at the time, really after the American Revolution. So if we sort of look at the timeline that I'm going to be talking about today, we're starting with the military dispossession of the Gayogohó by Sullivan-Clinton. Peter's already talked about that a little bit. Also the refuge that most all Gayogohó had at British Fort Niagara. Then at that point, most Gayogohó people resettled in locations outside of their homeland, but some Gayogohó people returned to the Cayuga Lake region. And if we look at sort of the fine fine-grained chronology there. I think those returnees were there at the very tail end of the American Revolution from 1780 to 1783. There was also a period of about 5 years where really nobody was contesting the fact that this remained Haudenosaunee territory from 1783 to 1788. And then you start to get settler encroachment really even before New York tries to acquire the land. And I'm going to argue that there was a period of uneasy coexistence between the Gayogohó people in the homelands and the early American settlers from about 1788 to around 1804. And of course, as Peter has outlined, this period also saw the dispossession through forced and apparently fraudulent treaties that were negotiated, especially by New York State, between 1789 and 1807. This image here is sort of a more modern map showing the approximate locations of the Gayogohó settlements that were destroyed by Sullivan-Clinton. The larger dots are the larger communities. The smaller triangles are sort of maybe one or two or small clusters of individual houses that also were destroyed. So I think it's very important to note that the Americans came in and destroyed Onoduwaka or Seneca and Gayogohó villages, stored and growing crops and orchards, but they left, okay? That's something that I think Americans sometimes forget. This was not sort of a conquer and occupy mission, but they went on their scorched earth campaign, and then they left, and the soldiers were dispatched to other campaigns in the American Revolution. And they even pulled down some of the forts that they had built as temporary sort of supply depots for the excavation. So, for the expedition. So as of about October 1779, the Americans had departed. The Gayogohó, of course, and the other refugees that were created by Sullivan-Clinton had no homes or food, and they really had no obvious place to take refuge because the Americans had really very systematically burned out all the Haudenosaunee communities that they perceived to be enemies of the United States. I think the reality was that many of those communities were actually neutral. And I think Steve Henhawk I work with Steve fairly frequently, and he's argued that none of the nations the indigenous nations in the revolution actually declared war on one side or the other. As a nation, it was left to individuals, clans, and other social units. So there was and Peter's also noted this, that there was a real division among many of the Gayogohó, although that one account doesn't mention a very sizable proportion of the Gayogohó who were neutral and tried to remain neutral until obviously they took a side after they were burned out by the Americans. So because there was no place to take refuge, and we also have to recognize that at that time, the use of horses and wagons was not particularly common among the Gayogohó, so that they had no other way of getting to refuge than to go to British Fort Niagara, 140 miles by foot. Okay, and as Steve has cited community memory as saying, at the end of that march, there were no babies and there were no old people left because they had all perished along the way. So this is, to some degrees, a Gayogohó trail of tears. Things were not much better when they reached Old Fort Niagara. The British provided very little support to. At some point, there were over 5,000 Haudenosaunee refugees at the fort, and this was quite literally one of the harshest winters on record. Climatologists have looked back, and you can really see, based on the evidence that they used, that this was a terrible, terrible cold winter, and there are records that there were 5 feet of snow on the ground consistently all winter. Many of the game animals died, but many of the Haudenosaunee also died from either starvation or exposure. So at this point, the Gayogohó divided, as Peter has related. Some stayed relatively near Fort Niagara, moving to Buffalo Creek, the modern, which is the modern city of Buffalo. Some eventually relocated to Canada, to the Grand River area, others to Ohio, but others did return to Cayuga Lake. I think it's quite likely that some Gayogohó people came home soon after Sullivan-Clinton, likely as soon as the next spring or summer of 1780. The largest resettlement took place at the north end of the lake, but I think the sources that I've cited suggest that there were returnees all over the region, really all around the lake. The overall population number is uncertain. There's one local history says that there were 600 people in the residence reservation around what is now Union Springs, but scholars and also Gayogohó community members mostly say that the number was significantly fewer than that. I'm not really sure where that comes from, but we'll see it again in a second. The returnees also included other people. There were Skarure or Tuscarora people who came to the Cayuga Lake region. There were peoples from the southeast, like the Saponis and Tutelos, who had taken refuge with the Gayogohó in the 1750s after they had been driven out of their homelands by English colonial encroachment. And there are also fairly frequent records of Lenapes or Delaware people living around the lake. As I've mentioned, I think initially there was little Euro-American presence. This was still native land. You start to see American exploration and a little initial settlement of the region in 1788, and then in 1789, coinciding with the New York Treaty that took most of Gayogohó territory, you start to get fairly substantial numbers of Americans moving into the region. So to try and understand this reoccupation, I'm an anthropologist, and I tend to use whatever kinds of sources that are available to me. So these include historical documents, things that were written at that time. Peter cited a number of those documents and the treaty texts and things. I also use local histories that were written by American settlers, where they were trying to document the early days of white settlement in the region, talking about the lives of people that they often call pioneers. There are also historic maps. There are Gayogohó oral histories, which Steve has been kind enough to share some aspects of those with me. And also, I am principally an archaeologist, so I'm very interested in the material residues of the reoccupation, although it's very, very poorly understood at the moment. I think it's definitely worth noting that these sources overwhelmingly were produced by American settlers, and they contain biases both obvious and subtle. So this map was made by the Surveyor General Simeon DeWitt in around 1790. And one of the things that I want to note here is that there are triangle symbols that represent indigenous communities. So that you can and then I've also outlined in blue the Cayuga, Onondaga, and Oneida reservations at that particular time. So just as an example, you can see the continued indigenous presence in the region through these particular maps. So a big question, and I think that there'll be some people that will wonder why I'm doing this, why I'm using in particular the town and county histories that were written in the 19th century. They are not usually seen as a reliable source of information about indigenous people. Most of them have a few pages of talking about the ancient history, sort of the artifacts that have been found there, and reconstructing their ideas about the ancient history of the Haudenosaunee. I will say that most of those are speculative and generally awful, that they really are not reliable at all. And we will also see that there are lots of ethnocentric judgments in these documents. So they have very clearly stated opinions about property and theft, industry and laziness, and also the quote-unquote ignorance and quote-unquote savagery of the indigenous peoples that they encountered. But I would argue that standard scholarly rules apply. You can look for instances where there are ethnocentric biases. You can look for instances where the texts would have benefited the writer, so therefore they might have written something that would have been to their advantage, usually material advantage. And then the last thing is to look for consistency across multiple accounts. And I think and I would argue that even despite the perceived weakness of local histories as a resource, I would argue that there are numerous consistent accounts of interaction between early American settlers and indigenous people that extend into the early 1800s. I'll just say a word about the paintings. Glenn Norris was the Tompkins County historian, and he's one of the few people that actually sort of tried to artistically represent what was going on at this particular time. So this is a representation of one of those early pioneer tales where some of the early white settlers of Ithaca were tried to kill a swimming bear from a dugout canoe. I think it was probably a very foolish endeavor, and don't do this at home. So I'm going to take the course of action of actually reproducing the page images from these local histories and highlighting some aspects of them. So this is from Stork and Smith's 1879 History of Cayuga County. And you can see at the very top, it says, at this time, 1791, there were some 600 Indians living on their reservation, okay? So that's where that figure comes from. Although I don't think the 600 can be trusted, I think that this is, it may be an indication that there were a significant number of indigenous folks at that time. Later on, they talk about the king and queen of the community. They call Steel Trap the king, and they call someone named Esther the queen. This is very clearly a misunderstanding about indigenous leadership. There are no kings, queens, princes, princesses. And also, I think that the part about Queen Esther may have been an exaggeration. Some of you may know about Queen Esther, who was a very famous indigenous leader during the American Revolution. And I think that there was always sort of an attempt to try and get famous indigenous historical figures into your town or county, and I think that may be part of what was going on there. Horace King delivered and published a lecture. It must have been a very, very long lecture about the history of Ithaca in 1847. And so I'll just read a couple of quotations here. In the second year, meaning the second year of American settlement, a man by the name of Lightfoot came up the lake with a boatload of goods. Here he put up a shanty in which he displayed and disposed of his goods and wares. And later on, these articles he exchanged principally for maple sugar and furs, the furs being marten, otter, beaver, fox, bear, and deer skins. So it doesn't actually mention who Lightfoot was trading with, but the goods that he acquired were really indigenous specialties, so maple sugar and furs in particular. And King continues later on to say that Lightfoot traded for 10 or 12 years, and meaning therefore up to about 1802. I've got a couple of references from Trumansburg, the Trumansburg area on the west side of Cayuga Lake, which is where I currently live. But the first one is from a history of the Falls of Taganok, published in 1872. And here it talks about an interview he had with a descendant of an original settler named George Goodwin. He said who owned Taganok Point. George Goodwin related that for a long time after his father settled at the point, although the land had nominally been sold to the white men, the Indians claimed the fruit of the orchard as their own. They would even steal the apples before they were ripe, and it was several years before they ceased to be troublesome. Another source indicates that that the original Goodwin settled on the point about 1794. So I think that the fact that those trees were bearing fruit suggested that they were probably Gayogohó trees that he had taken over. So I think that puts this in a very different light. The Gayogohó weren't stealing apples; they were actually harvesting fruit from trees that they had planted and cultivated. This is probably my favorite line in all of the local histories. An 1890 history of Trumansburg: Indians were not plenty, but scarcely a day passed without meeting one. Oops. So, of course, I have to say something about Auburn, given that's where I'm speaking. And I have both here something from Henry Hall's 1869 History of Auburn, and also a historical marker. That's where the internet says it's fixed. I wasn't able to verify that for myself, but it appears that there was a community of Gayogohó people living right where John Hardenberg established himself in 1793. The alcohol trade here is said to have commenced in about 1797, and then there's an account later on where the settlers hear a big ruckus coming from the indigenous community, and I'll quote, "Hastening to the spot, the settlers found the savages fighting like demons, pelting each other with firebrands and throwing burning sticks and embers into each other's lodges and making the forest ring with fierce yells. Before morning, they had all left the camp and fled away into the wilderness, from which they never returned." And I would argue that this is one of those self-serving descriptions of what happened. I think the idea that the indigenous people were attacking each other and then they permanently vacated the region seems a little bit too convenient, I think, in terms of what likely actually happened. So we can look at maps as well. One of the questions that one can always have about maps is the information current or is it out of date, okay? And so one of the questions about these maps, and also the DeWitt Clinton one that I showed you earlier, is whether these settlements were actually being occupied by indigenous people in the 1790s or whether they were just those communities that had been burned by Sullivan-Clinton. Okay, so this map, as an example, there are some places here where Sullivan-Clinton did go through and destroy things. So Owego, Newtown, Catharines-town south of Seneca Lake. But there are also two communities indicated here where Sullivan's troops did go through those regions and found nothing. There were no communities there in 1779. So in particular, that one symbol for an indigenous community at the southwest corner of Seneca Lake, and of more interest to a presentation on the Gayogohó, the one on the southeast corner of Cayuga Lake. If you look at the creeks, that's probably in present-day Cayuga Heights. So I would argue that all of these, they have very similar symbols. There are actually little pictures of houses with smoke rising from the top as if out of a smoke hole. So I think that these all represent living indigenous communities in 1794 and 1795. Archaeology, I would say that there's nothing definitive of yet. The local histories do give indications of where there might have been post-1779 indigenous sites. So for example, the Hewitt's History of Tompkins County talks about a winter camp in 6 Mile Creek Gorge. And then there's another local history source from much later, but it's reflecting some family lore, where it says one of the last camping sites of the Cayuga Indians was in Cayuga Heights, where they made baskets to trade with the American settlers. I think that that's credible because it lines up with the map that I just showed you. I will also say that they talk about camps and campsites, but I think that this is really sort of minimizing settlements that were intended to be much more permanent and substantial than that. There was an excavation done in advance of Cornell putting up a new athletic field in a somewhat remote area from the campus it's on Upper Cascadilla Creek. It may be a post-revolutionary indigenous site. It's pretty clear that there was a house there, but that house was never recorded on any of in the American deed system, and it's not shown on any of the maps, which is a little unusual. There are also a few items of material culture that may suggest that indigenous people lived there, including a gunflint, a button, some smoking pipe fragments, and 2 glass beads. But I would be hard-pressed to see the rest of the assemblage looks very similar to what American settlers of the time would have been using. So I think the jury is still out on that particular site. Gayogohó oral histories, there are stories kept at Six Nations Reserve in Ontario that make reference to post-revolutionary residents in the homelands. They depict interactions with early American settlers. They do describe treaty negotiations, and Stephen's going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. They talk about travel and trade, including the trading of fish. And another detail is that they talk about the value of certain ceramic plates, which I think is a reference that must refer to the post-revolutionary period, because there are not really plates found in any numbers on earlier Haudenosaunee archaeological sites. We also shouldn't neglect the fact, though, that there was scattered incidents of violence between indigenous people and settlers. And we have to also note that whenever an indigenous person harmed a settler, it was documented very, very thoroughly. One of the more famous examples is when Indian John, who was reportedly either Lenape or Onondaga, killed Ezekiel Crane in the town of Tyre in fall 1803. There was a trial in Aurora, and Indian John was executed in 1804. So this is one of the accounts. This is a history of Seneca County. You will see it says the year 1803 still saw the Indians swarming in the forests. Okay. And then later on, there's an account of how the killing happened, and I think there was a case of mistaken identity, but Indian John was executed regardless. There's another account about the trial, which interestingly says a few of the natives appear to have been present at the execution. So this would have been in 1804. Steve, when we've talked about this era, Steve Henhawk has said that we also have to recognize, although there's not really very much documentation to that effect, we have to recognize that there was violence by settlers against Gayogohó people that really did not make it into the documentary record, again, because I think that was something that the settlers didn't want to sort of associate themselves with. So I think these accumulated sources suggest that there was a fragile coexistence between Gayogohó returnees and early American settlers from the years around 1788 to 1804. We certainly can see that there were frequent misunderstandings, particularly regarding access to property and resources like the apples on Taganic Point. This coexistence seems to have been based largely on trade. I guess here's another image that Glenn Norris did. It didn't mention who Lightfoot was trading with, but you can see that Glenn Norris definitely thought that he was trading with indigenous people, because a couple of them are coming out through the woods. So the settlers acquired things like furs, baskets, moccasins, maple sugar, salt, and fish. That's what you get when you accumulate all the sources I've been talking about. When you do the same thing for what the Gayogohó people were interested in, they wanted to get manufactured goods, including ceramic plates. They wanted firearms and ammunition, and then also alcohol, which had some damaging implications. So I think that this coexistence eventually frayed, and this is another another insight that Steve gave me, that he said that the violence increased as settlers became more self-sufficient and they no longer needed indigenous people to provide those goods to them. They started to be able to make themselves, obtain them themselves, and that's when the level of violence stepped up, because they were the settlers no longer had a use for the indigenous people. So things got increasingly rough in that period, I think, as time went along. I think, although I'm only covering up to about 1804 here, the Gayogohó oral histories do say that there was a continued presence of Gayogohó people here, probably in very low numbers, to keep an eye on their homelands. And I haven't really gone through and looked at later sources, but there are definitely accounts. I know that there's one where they're having an event for veterans of the War of 1812, and a very old Cayuga guy shows up, and everybody's sits in the front row, and everybody's like, "What are you doing here?" You know, so that would have been in the middle of the 1800s, and I think it would be a very worthwhile endeavor to go through and try and find that evidence for native presence later on. So the takeaways from this, in my estimation, would be that currently the Gayogohó reoccupation is very poorly understood and mostly forgotten, especially by American settlers in this region. This time period, when it is talked about at all, is usually portrayed as the last gasp of a dying people, instead of a purposeful reconnection to the homeland after Sullivan-Clinton that was sustained as long as possible. The reality of the Gayogohó reoccupation turns popular narratives among American settlers away from the inaccurate idea that land was taken by Sullivan-Clinton through conquest. As I mentioned before, the Americans got the hell out, and they didn't come back in any numbers for about 9 years. And instead, it turns our attention to the dispossession that happened through forced and contested treaties, like the ones that Peter and Stephen are going to talk about today. So thanks very much.
These two guys, they're a tough act to follow. Like I had said when we started, this is what we're speaking of today is the way I title this is community perspectives of this, because what I'm going to share here is the ideas and the things that I was fortunate to be exposed to through and I need to state this. I say this all the time. All of this, what we've looked at, everything that I've shared with Kurt, everything that I've shared, pretty much everything to do with our thing. This is where it comes from. I get it from the place that we're from, Six Nations Reserve. I need to state that very clear, that this is where this understanding, this is where this language, this is where this everything, this is where it lives now, is at Six Nations Reserve. So I state this very clear. And that's what this is. It's community perspectives is what I call this. So I start with this, I say this, that this is, it's really difficult to talk about because as you may have gathered up to this point, every one of these treaties are fraudulent in many different perspectives. You look at the ideas of this, and also what needs to be stated in this is there's been so much that hasn't been done up to this point. The biggest piece that hasn't been done up to this point is to look at this idea from our perspective. If you'll notice, in every one of these instances, I'm friends with Kurt. I consider him my friend. I hope to become a friend with Mr. Whiteley here as well. But I don't say these things. Why I say these things is, up to this point, who have the experts been on this? They've been non-Indigenous people. There's been, up to this point, every one of these experts in here have been somebody that's non-Indigenous. And I myself, I need to state this, where I don't consider myself an expert on this by any means. What I consider myself is lucky that I listened to the old people. I consider myself very lucky that I listened, that I was given an opportunity to learn these things and to understand, because, and like I said, up to this point, up to now, we haven't been given this opportunity. If you look at any of these court cases up to this, not once have they come and spoke to anybody that understood this language. They chose not to, for an apparent reason. And we can move in, we can look at a lot of these. So this is why I state this, that it's hard to talk about for me. And how I say this, because I recognize people in here. I have, friends in the back, family that's here, that I understand, we understand that this is hard to even talk about, to even see this, because they are fraudulent. And especially for us that's from Canada, that had to grow up in Six Nations, that weren't to be here. And what this is again, I talked a little bit about this, is that the people that I was lucky to learn from when I was young, because I went to school, because I was attending school, because I could read, a lot of my teachers couldn't read. They didn't read English. A lot of them didn't really, their English wasn't too well. Because I was able to read these books, I was able to read things. I understood things I started to understand what was happening here. And I would ask my teachers, these guys, great men of our people. I was so lucky to sit with Jake Thomas, Kant, Muck Mitz, Robbie Smoke, all of these guys. These names here, I can name these names off. But you know what? Those were the guys that understood this. Those were the ones that totally understood this, but those were the experts. Not one person in here knows who those people are. There might be two in the back that know. There might be that understand who these people were, what their significance were. Those were the experts. But not once did anybody choose to talk to those people. Not once. But the thing is, this is why, and those were the people that those were my teachers. And I would ask them about this. When I was young, I would say, tell me about these things. Tell me about this. And they refused so many times. They said no. They said, no, we're not gonna, we don't want to, because this is exactly what they say. This is exactly what they say. They said, it's only gonna make you mad. You're only gonna get mad. And they said, we got other things what we want you to learn. I was fortunate to be, heavily involved in, ceremonial language, different things like that. So that's what they directed me to learn. They didn't want me to learn this. As I got older, that's when they finally started to change their minds about that. They would teach me, they would share some of the ideas of what this was. And it's a really significant piece into this, is because another reason why I was so fortunate to be able to with this, is because when they would speak of this, they would only speak of it in our language. They would only speak of it in Gayogohó or Onondaga, depending who I was sitting with. And I would ask them, I would say, there's others in the room here that don't understand. I said, Samanadani, I would say, to translate for others that might not understand. And they would say no. And I would say, why is this? And a lot of people, they would say they were hiding our history, and they weren't. What they were trying to do was they were trying to save our people from this hurt. That's exactly why they were doing that. And there's another reason why the language was so important in this, is because our elders, when they spoke of something that was highly cherished, or something that was very highly important to our people, they wouldn't mar it with English. they would only speak of it in Gayogohó. And the reason for that was for the clarity, because when we speak in our languages, in Gayogohó language or any Haudenosaunee language, there's a clarity that comes with that it cannot be marred in any way. Like English, one word can mean 7 different things, to whereas within Gayogohó, if you speak of this, when you speak of it in Gayogohó, it remains straight and it remains intact. There's no way to change the meanings of these things. With this, we look at the way that I've done this is our oral history. Like I said, I'm lucky to work with Kurt closely amongst other peoples. And what I've found is that our oral history, that it matches very well with the documentary record that we have. We look at the idea of this treaty, what we're talking about here. When they finally told me about what had happened here, the way that they described it was, the first thing that they came to this, the first thing that they saw was, and it would be in the language, they would say, what they would say was that there was rows of glasses that was lined up. That's the first thing that we seen when we got there. That's what was lined up for us. That there was rows of what we called the Ganõ, some mind changers of alcohol. That's what it was lined up on these tables that they had when we got there. That was the first idea, the first thing that we had seen when we got here. And that's through oral history when we talk about this ferry treaty. And when they talked about this, they would say that's what it was, that it was alcohol had been highly influenced in this. And that's when they talk about it, they say that's the first thing. It says that when those guys got there, they said that they said that that's what it was, that there was tables, and that's the exact word that they said, that there was all these glasses. There was glasses of booze, glasses of alcohol that was there. It was lined up. And they would go on to talk about what had happened here through this treaty. And I learned this, it would be a long time ago now, and I was in my late teens and 20s. A lot of this, it was information that I held, I kept in me for a long time, that I didn't share, I didn't talk about it until I got an opportunity to come home. When I come home, when I got to be able to come back, I got to sit with Kurt here, and we were talking about this, and this was the idea of, I share with him the oral histories of these events and things, and that's what I had told him was about this treaty. That's what stands out in there in the recollection of these rows of glasses of the alcohol that was served prior to it. That was the first thing that was done. That's when Kurt, he told me, he says, "Well, did you know that was done at a tavern? This treaty, that's where it was signed. It was signed at a tavern." So we didn't know that through the oral history. When I was being taught that, it didn't say that it was at an actual tavern. What stood out in there was these rows of glasses that they had set up. They said that was the first thing that was the first item that was there. And what goes on further than this is, at this time period, that's what we expected. We knew that that's what was going to be there. We knew that that's what it was, alcohol was to be, we knew that alcohol was going to be a part of all of these ideas. And we look at this 1795, and this is, and again, this was the only one that was negotiated right here at what we know as Cayuga Lake, you know what I mean? It took place and Kurt even shared with me this guy's name, John Harris. He was the one that owned this tavern that put this up. And so this is, when I say this is an instance of how our oral history, how it matches very clearly with what is documented here. What I wanted with this, what I'm sharing here today is these are the names of our 10 Hoyá, our title holders, different things. There's 10 of them. What these individuals do, they convey the message of the people. They are authorized voices of Gayogohó families. If you'll notice in this interpretation here, not once do I use the word chief, not once is the word sachem put onto this, because that's your language. That's not our language. What that has done, that has marred our understanding, even our Haudenosaunee people's understanding of what this means, of what Hõyá means. When in English, when we're speaking, we say chief, sachem. That shows a hierarchy. It shows that somebody is above someone else. That is totally against the idealism of Haudenosaunee people. That's why when we say, that's why it's important for me to share this, because these Hõyá, we'll call them title holders. They're not chiefs, they're not sachems. What that does is, when we use that language, it already puts something in our minds that they're a leader, that they're above everybody else. And why I share this is because, like I said, it's even marred our own people's understanding of this, because we've gotten away from our language, because we tend to use English now. And even this is a part of the assimilation process that's been there. So why I share these is, these are the people that are authorized voices for the Gayogohó families. Still to this day, there is only 10 families of Gayogohó people. Only 10. Anyone of us who say that we're Gayogohó, we fall under one of these 10 families. That's what these represent. They're families. They're 10 families, and that's all there is. This whole diaspora that's been created, we're still a part of this. We still fall under one of these. The name that Peter had been mentioning, Hagaanyo, or was it Yongo? Which one was it? Hagaanyo, right? This guy right here. Hagaanyo. This one is the only name that we see that occurs that may be a possible Hõyá, a possible title holder in any of the signings. So why I share this is because in order for any of these to be legitimized in any possible way, you would see 10 of those names. You would see all of those names that I had shared. Those would be there in some sort of way or another. I talk a little bit about the names that we do see. We see Steel Trap, right? We see Steel Trap, his name in here. He's got his name is reoccurring all the time. Ganϊ or something. I've been doing and like I said, I'm very fortunate to be able to. I speak my language. I speak Gayogohó. I understand all the other four languages. The only one I'm working on is my friends the Tuscarora and the Dust that I'm working on to get that. But with these here, I've looked at these names and I've shared it with other elders and I says other speakers, and I said, what can we get something out of this? We've looked at the name that's reoccurring for Steel Trap. Goodness, I can't even, you know what I mean? But we've done it. We found a root word in it. The root word has nothing to do with steel. The root word has nothing to do with trap. The root word is corn cob. Onista. Okay. Amongst all of these other names, we've done extensive work on it. We've started to do extensive work to really look at what these names are. We've found that these names are Very few are Gayogohó. Most are, you can tell who was writing these. We can tell that James Dean was a principal writer in here because all of the names, they have an Oneida slant on them. Every one of them has an Oneida slant on them. It could be, so this guy, what it is he's the guy that's writing, he's the interpreter for them, but he doesn't understand any of this. What he's doing, he's really trained by the Oneidas, so everything what he writes has this Oneida slant on it. So it's really hard to either say there was a bunch of Oneidas that was signing for us, or this guy was trying to translate Gayogohó names and put them into Oneida. I'm probably going to say that there was a bunch of Oneidas there. James Dean, we look at, there's a little history of him here. He learned the language, he was reported to be adopted by them. And I think this is an interesting piece in here because James Dean is the one that says that he was adopted by them. If you go and see any Oneida living today, they're going to say, no, we never adopted this guy. He was never adopted. He never was because of his role. We look at, and this is something what I had just talked about, the influence of the names of the signatories. There's a heavy influence of this Oneida because of where he is. What I've come to find, my conclusion with this is there's two things that are possible. Either he was an awful translator, or he was in on the fact that he knew the whole thing was a fraud. There's only two possible ways with this. And some of these names, what I've done is I've really taken them apart and really looked at them. There's one that's Oneida Witness that's at Fort Stanwix. It jumps right out at me. Anybody. It's pronounced as Aguistones. Why that jumped right out at me is because what it means. It means I'm making money. This, by no means would that be anyone's, for one thing, it's not one of our 10 traditional title holders. The next thing, it wouldn't even be a hereditary because all of us here, Haudenosaunee people, we're lucky that we still have, like, I said, oh, my name's Stephen. That's not my name. That's just a name that I got to use. We're lucky that we still have our what we know as our given names, our real names. We still have that. And these names are hereditary. So if this was the case, this Aguistones, this person that their name was I'm making money, that would never be a hereditary name. It never would be. It never would be. So, and why I say this, why I put this on expert translator Mr. Dean here, is because if he was so good, he would have known that meant either he would have known that meant I'm making money, or the other pieces he was in it. He was in on the fraud. If he understood this, he was in on it. So this is just one example of in here. And there's other names in here as well that are like this, where it's there's a play on words that's happening within these names. And this is where, again, and this is what I say is anything to do with our culture and our understanding, It's embedded in our language. Everything is embedded in our language. And this is the reasoning why it was so important for the assimilation process, for that to be taken away, so that we wouldn't be able to do this. Because I look at this and I just understand my language. But the thing is, if this would have been done, if this would have been shown to people prior to me, what I think about things that have happened, all of these land deals, even the latest ones that have happened. Not once did they take a serious look or have a serious view from a language point of view. Not once did they do that. And I'll say this, that was another intentional move. Because if they did, because like when all of these were happening, like me, I consider myself lucky that I can speak my language. I understand. I say this. I know this much compared to what my teachers understood. And those guys were alive 20 years ago. So like if this stuff would have happened, and I think about this, if Kurt would have had a chance to sit with Mohammeds, with Jake Thomas, if Whiteley had a chance to sit with those guys, the things that they would have told them, the things that they could have straightened out at that time. But the thing is, it just didn't happen. It didn't happen for whichever reason. For whichever reason. I share this here. This is a list of names. You'll see a lot of the that's in here. The first one appears to be a Mohawk name. Another one, Mohawk name. The third one, Red Jacket. We got Senegas, we got Mohawk, Seneca. Got another one, Oneida, another Oneida name, another Mohawk name. You look at all of these, how many Gayogohó are on this? Next to none, next to zero. There is some apparent names that will jump out in here. We look at this one, what we see become famous names because, hanging face, you know what I mean? It's clearly a Gayogohó. Well, this is where we need to change this slide. It's clearly a Gayogohó name. It's clearly a Gayogohó word. It's not clearly a Gayogohó name. I got to say this, that it's not a Gayogohó name. But what I think it is, it's a nickname that was given to this fella. And probably what it was, he probably had a paralysis in his face. Because when we say this, Ogosaniyon, well, it really would be Hagosaniyon, that he had this. It would be, and that's probably what it was referred to. It never would be a hereditary name. We wouldn't do that because that's not Haudenosaunee way to do that, to do that. So this is, there's another one that comes out that I can kind of see in there, Ongwe Goa, and it would be Ongwe people and Goa is something large. So it would be something like it was describing a large crowd. But again, this would never be a formal name. It wouldn't be a formal name. There would be something, but it would be put together in a better way. So why I share this, because you can see at some instances that there is Gayogohó reference into the names here, that there's some that's there. Then there's a lot of garbled names, things that are really garbled. But what I can see pieces of it to where it is Gayogohó in here. Like the first one, the prefix I can see, that something is being done for us, the sago in there. Other ones, you look at the suffix on that one, adi or dadi is, that suffix is something going to be on the other side of something. You might be familiar with a word that you know what this is already. There's a town right around here, Schenectady. Duddy, that same, really what Schenectady means is on the other side of the bed. It's on the other side of the bed. I don't know why they call it that, It's an odd name, but that's what it means. So that same suffix, that duddy, means on the other side of something. So you can see it there. The next one is wane. You can see something that is large, something that's big. The next one is totally unintelligible. The third one here is another unintelligible piece, but based on the prefix of I in the beginning, we can see that that might be a lady's name, because in Gayogohó, our names, if it's a female name, it'll start with that. It can start with I, that sound of I. And then the last one, you can see the prefix is Ganõ in here. You can see that it's a town. So why I share this is some of these you can see that there is an actual, it's coming from an actual Gayogohó word or Gayogohó name. So I guess why I share this is that that they were there. Some of it was close. Some of it was close. But like I said, with these people who was doing it, and this is where we see hőnyȯhk. This one is kind of that we can kind of see, and it's what it is. It's pronounced with an Oneida dialect, so we can see that this is probably Dean that was writing at this time, and this is how he writes it. But I'm sure he's talking about Gayogohó, this fella, and he's a Hoyá for the Black Wolves at that time. But again, this would be one possible title holder that may have been there, possible title holder that may have been there at that time. And this is where we look at some of the information on these individuals. What we know is fish carrier, this guy here. This name here, I'll say this, it's not even close. It's not even close. There's one piece in here that might be close to hõnyȯhk, or that might be something to do with a fish. That's because in our language, hõnyȯhk is a fish, or Ganȯ, however you want to look at this. So there might be a piece in there that's close to something to do with a fish. But the carrier and all of that stuff, it's not even in there at all. It's not even in there at all. And I say this because fish carrier, what we know as fish carrier is we especially us at Ganõ, there's a part of this. He has this history here of this and things, but he has a different history. What we know of him as when he's always spoken of this guy, they always say Hagawe, and he was a boatman that he knew. He knew the boats, he knew the waters of this place, and how we knew of him is what he did was where he lived. He lived at present day, and this is another one that it's close. It's really Ganȯ. That's how you say that. It's not Ganõ, it's Ganõ, and that's the actual place, and that's where Fish Basket lived. And well, I'm going to say this, you know what I mean? Fish carrier, he's got it all wrong. They got it wrong. And really, if you're going to translate his name, it's a fish basket, and it's really that's if you really want to know, that's what, like, we know who this guy was, and it's a fish basket is actually what it was. He was known for fishing, and he would have there were baskets that they would carry fish in, and that's what they called him, was this guy. And like through documentation, we place him, we know he's at Fort Niagara. And one piece what I want to share in this in here is okay, through oral history, and if we look at the dates and the times of this, through oral history, through our understanding, Fish Basket isn't even here signing. He's at Oswego. Because at this time, 1795, we're already establishing. We're already there. And that's where he was. He was already there. And one piece in here that stands out to us, that always stood out to us when I was told about this is this piece in here of he personally allocates 1 square mile of territory at Ganȯ for himself. This totally contradicts Gayogohó idealism, Gayogohó values, Gayogohó relationships with the land. This never would have happened. He never would have did this. I know that they never would have did this because Gayogohó Wifwagé, the idea of Gayogohó is that it's never for us. It's never for an individual. It's not even for now or today. It's about in the future. And why I know this and why I say this is because this fish basket, this picture that we've seen, there was a picture of his grandson in here. His family, what he did, what we know of today, and this is, like I said, there's one person in this room that's going to understand this, and I'm going to say it. What we know of where Cayuga Longhouse is today, okay, where the Longhouse sits, that house right on the corner there, that was the last residence of the fish carriers. That's where that picture that we had up there, Henry, that his name was Henry, that's him. That they were the last ones that lived there. And what this is why it's so important. If you look at the proximity of where that is and to where the Longhouse is, they were the ones that started that Longhouse, that said, we need a place to rekindle the fire again. So this is how I know that would never, he never would have done that. He never would have allocated one piece for himself. And through our oral histories, this is where we understand that he wasn't here. He wasn't even here. He was over there setting something up for the people, trying to restart the fire is what he was doing. What this is we understand that prior to this, that fish basket, steel trap, Handsome Lake, Little Beard, they all used to hang out. They were all boatmen, is what they were. They were all boatmen. They were all traders, and they did these things. But what happens is steel traps in there too. There's a falling out that happens. You heard Peter talk about it a little bit. I think Kurt mentions it a little bit when we get to Buffalo Creek, that there's people that stay there and there's people that go over there. And there's this division that happens. Steel trap, what we know of steel trap, that this guy, and I don't even like to use this steel trap because it doesn't say anything. We're probably going to change his name to Corn Cob. Because in the notes, that's what it says, is Corn Cob. You know what I mean? So that's probably really what it was. And through our oral history, we know of who this steel trap was. We know that he wasn't even Gayogohó. He wasn't even Cayugas. We know that his father was from Syracuse, from Onondaga. And we know that his father was known as, this guy was called Old Redhead. So presumably, Steel Trap had Euro-American ancestry in him. If we knew that his father was Old Redhead, this makes that there's Euro-American ancestry that in here. And what this sets up is this idea of when Steel Trap, when he sets this idea of up at 1795, this is after they have their falling out. So this is why he puts in there, he personally allots that 1 square mile for fish basket so that the onus goes on him. But through the oral history, we understand that he wasn't here, that he didn't even come back at that time. And through the oral history, we understand that after we hear about it, then that's when they have to come back. Because through this, we understand that, and this is where what happened to our people is, it would have been this idea of duplicate titles, to where there was a title that, what we say is these title holders that was in Grand River, and there was some that was trying to stay here. And what was happening was They were just finding anybody to sign these treaties. And this is where Steel Trap and a lot of them, they step up to the plate. They step up to the plate to be able to do these ideas. And this is the thing, is how many signatories that were Hõyá that were authorized to be the voice of these. I've gone through these. We've looked at these. We looked in 1784, Fort Stanwix. There's none. Look at Albany. There's none there. None again. 1794, there's none. Possibly there's one at this Cayuga Ferry signing. And in 1807, possibly there's one. Possibly. See, in these ideas, there's no definitive. Through the definitive ideas of oral history, what we say that there was none. That there was none because if there was people that was portraying themselves as these, you can't do that because there's certain protocols and things that need to go to happen. So even if these ones that knew these names that were signing the name, that doesn't mean anything if the protocols weren't followed. So a lot of these ideas, so even if there was a name on it, we say that there was none. And this is where there's a common in Haudenosaunee communities, and I say this is common within Gayogohó communities, especially here in the U.S. side of things, to where there's a common idea, and you hear this over and over again, to where they will say, the chiefs sold us out. They sold all our land. They did this. But this is clearly not true because it wasn't our Haudenosaunee that made these land deals. It wasn't any of them that did this. This was done by individuals on their own. And I don't want to sit here and blame things because that's part of the plan. Part of this plan, if you look and you look back, the plan was to divide us. And that's what's been done. It's been done in a great way. Our people, the way that our people are, when you ask a person who they are, the first thing that we say is we're Haudenosaunee. That's who we are first. We're Haudenosaunee. We understand that because we view ourselves as one people. And that's the way that it was meant to be, that through all of this, that we were going to be one people. But when all of this started, if you remember, Peter had mentioned it, to where they would not deal with us as one. They needed to deal with us they wanted to deal with us as individuals. No, you got to deal with the Cayugas, the Onondagas, the Oneidas. That's what they did. And they've done it even further systematically to where now they don't even deal with us as one people. Now we're divided into 3 to 4 different groups now. But we're still all Gayogohó. We're still all Gayogohó. This is where I want to leave this. I want to wrap this up because our families, again, we're so lucky in this room. We have families here that are Gayogohó, Tasquaywe. We have them here. That we still honor and we still use our Haudenosaunee. We still use these. And this is why it's so important that we speak and we use this, because this needs to be understood that it wasn't our Haudenosaunee, it wasn't our title holders that did this. This was individuals that had taken it upon themselves to do it. And again, further than that, I don't say this to divide our people further. I say this because these were all acts of survival. Everyone was an act of survival. I look at every one of these. To say that they were signed under duress is an understatement. Is an understatement. Because if you look at what our people had just gone through a few short years prior to this, the total destruction of our lands, the total destruction of our livelihoods, the total destruction of our they took away our ability to live, is really what it did. They took away our food system. There's no other word to put that under anywhere else. That's a genocide that had happened to our people. Why I say this and why this needs to be stated is because it was not our Haudenosaunee that did this. And like I said, I don't say these things, and I don't say it to divide our people even further, because I say this, those were acts of survival, the way it does. But the reason, and it's just in the future when we move forward, that's why the slide that I said it's difficult to talk about these things and difficult to do these things, it really is true. But the reason why I choose to do this is because I think that this is our last chance to straighten things out, to make things right, and for the truth to be known. Because if the truth isn't known about what had happened, there's no way that we can understand and move forward in a good possible way. Thank you for listening.
And what is wampum?
Logan? Peter?
I have to excavate what little is left of my memory. But Chief Logan was a notable orator. He was a little earlier than all this, and I think he was born on the Susquehanna River. So he was a Cayuga who was based further south, but I think it was Thomas Jefferson who characterized him as being the most eloquent speaker at a certain point. But yeah, he's a bit earlier than this. I think he's 1750s, 1760s. But I don't trust my memory anymore, and it's possible that Kurt or Stephen will have a better idea.
Well, I'm probably. Let's see. He's a Gayogohó, right, Steve? And so I think, and I know there's some sentiment that he was born in Auburn, and I don't know that I can. Is that no? Okay, so all right, yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah, on the Susquehanna. Okay, so there were Gayogohó people who had I established what I call colonies where they had radiated out from the homeland, and some of them were in Ohio, some of them were in Pennsylvania, and he was one of the people. His families had relocated down there. They remained connected to the homeland, but a little bit separate from it as well. And so he really got entangled in some of the wars in Pennsylvania, and I believe that's where his family was killed. And then there's the famous speech. I don't know whether there are some people who think that was faked. There are a lot of dying Indian speeches. It was a genre. It's a convenient genre for settlers to have, the last words of a dying indigenous person, because then you don't have to deal with them anymore. It's the sort of thing. He's very famous. I think that if you look across the country, there are all sorts of places that want a piece of Logan. There are Boy Scout camps in a few different states that are named after him. Auburn wants a piece of it. I don't know. What would you add there, Steve?
I think just that again, he's Logan. He becomes famous, and you'll notice one thing. What I should point out: every famous Gayogohó person that is known, if you'll notice the different, what's the commonality in there? They happen to have an English name. Logan, Chief Logan, right? Who else? Fish carrier, steel trap. Why are they famous? Because it's easy for the colonists to say it. Hőnyŭhk doesn't become famous at all. Hőnyŭhk. Kajit Nadarwehe. None of them. But they were probably more famous than Chief Logan. And again, Chief Logan, he's a figure. He becomes like a famous figure to where he's written about. He's written about here. Chief Logan is from all the way from Auburn. You go into Pennsylvania, all the way to Oklahoma to Kansas. He's famous. So he becomes, and like I said, everybody wants to write a story about this. So I'll say that he was an actual person, but his story becomes fictionalized over and over. I guess the second piece of your question is, what is wampum? Wampum is a shell that was made into a bead that's used for beads, and within Haudenosaunee people, it carries a very high value. Historically, it's been used to convey messages and also to document important historical events.
Thank you. Sherry?
I was just wondering about the connection with women, since I've heard that a lot of the culture was matrilineal, and I was just wondering how that merits in this argument about the not validity of some of these treaties. If women weren't there, they didn't sign it, so did they get permission? Was there any evidence of that?
That's yours, Steve, I think.
There is, in some of the treaties, I think we have, 11 signatories that may be women. But you are totally right. Our societies are matrilineal. If the truth really be known of how our societies work, you're correct that the women have the voices. That's who really are the decision makers within our people. Like I said, the names that you see on there, all those names are just orators. They're just people that convey the messages of the people. But the people are really run by the mothers of our nation. So to answer that correct, yes, it is very matrilineal. And this is how we know that this is fraudulent, because there is no mention of the women in here. And if it were to be if it was coming from our point of view, there would be more of that voice would be more prevalent within it.
Thank you. I'll do him and then you.
You kind of touched on this when you talked about Richardson, but on the New York State side of the negotiation of the Cayuga Ferry Treaty, there was such self-dealing where Richardson's, negotiating for land that he's leasing directly, where John Contain is both a land speculator and he's an adjudicator of the lands that he's then trying to negotiate out. Could you go into that into some more detail, please?
Yeah, I think they all had an interest. It's very interesting to me that Philip Schuyler is the chief commissioner for the negotiation of the Cayuga Ferry treaties. According to Larry Hauptman, who's looked into this most extensively, Schuyler was very interested in acquiring lands for the Inland Lock Navigation Company, which is the predecessor to the Erie Canal Company. And Larry certainly thinks that why Philip Schuyler was a really important guy, right? He was major general in the Revolutionary War, and was a big, the Schuyler family in New York goes back to the 17th century. His grandfather generation. I mean, they were all mayors of Albany and governors of New York and all that. I mean, the Haudenosaunee name for the mayor of Albany is Curator, which is the representation of the word Peter, and it's for Peter Schuyler, who was one of the original Dutch Schuylers who came to New York. I think that Larry's book is the title of which is escaping me.
Conspiracy of interests.
Sorry?
A conspiracy of interest.
Thank you. Yeah, it's definitely worth reading, and I think he makes this case strongly for why Schuyler would want to show up at these treaties, the three treaties of Cayuga, Oneida, and Onondaga. Canteen, yes, was a surveyor and was definitely a speculator in these properties. Richardson, I think, is the most instrumental on the land itself, as it were. He gets several of these sort of allotted areas afterwards. There's one south of the Residence Reservation where his name, you can clearly see that. But north of it, there's two or three others as well. North of it is William Richardson, who is his dad. And he and a sister is married to John Harris. So there were all this group who were interested in the reservation lands. 200 of them were described as living there in 1790 or 91. So it wasn't like at that point there were no settlers. As Kurt pointed out, that was certainly the case after 1779. There were no settlers for a bunch of years after that, but very shortly after the Livingston lease, and as far as we can tell, infer from the record, under the authority of the Livingston lease, is how John Richardson and John Harris, Samuel Harris, and so on and so forth, they moved in. So there was, and after the treaty was negotiated, there was a committee sitting in Albany that refused to sign off on it, because although the treaty was characterized, an act, or the act that authorized the treaty was characterized as an act to sort of to benefit the Cayugas, the Onondagas, and Egbert Benson, who was that commissioner sitting in Albany, said, it was designed to benefit the state, and because it stipulated that any lands acquired under this would be sold for at least 4 times as much as they were purchased for. So clearly there was a lot of self-interest and double dealing in that. But as I say, I think Richardson was probably the major figure, since he was, the other three, Canteen was he's a surveyor. Who's the fourth one? I've forgotten his name. But anyway, he was a military officer. He had skills. Richardson was, I'm sure he was interested in the land and so forth, but he wasn't a general. He didn't have any of these other qualities that might, suggest that he was suitable for the position of negotiating this thing. He only had access to the land. And anyway, afterwards, this was a period of time in my own sort of research that it was just confined to a short space of time. But I learned afterwards that he and his family moved to Indiana, to the Wabash, and he actually became a state assemblyman or something like that. But I had assumed that they remained in the area, but apparently they didn't. They all sold off their lots and made money and moved on.
I guess maybe one thing to add, just in case, when we're talking about the Schuylers, yes, those are the same Schuylers that are in Hamilton the musical, right? So it's the same family. We're painting a rather different picture of them here, I think, than they do in the musical. So.
I was debating whether or not to ask this question until you mentioned the word genocide. How comparable, this goes for all three of you, I'd like to hear all of your opinion on this. As a historian, how comparable would the violence against both sides be to modern genocide, such as the Armenian genocide, the Congo, what's happening with Israel and the Palestinians, where we know the settlers, especially the Israeli settlers, going into Palestine, which could be a model for the American settlers going into indigenous lands, are incredibly violent against their neighbors. How comparable could something like that be to what happened to the Haudenosaunee?
There's certainly an academic, there really is a whole academic branch of genocide studies. There's a journal devoted to it. There are people who do exactly that sort of work in terms of really comparing the scope, the methods, the duration, all of the things that you're talking about. I would say that's not something I do. If I was going to give you an opinion, it wouldn't be scholarly. And so therefore, I don't think it really is worth your time to hear my opinion on that. But there is, I certainly agree with Steve's characterization of the actions of Sullivan-Clinton as genocide. I don't think there's any question in my mind about that. So I think that would be my response.
Again, yes. To me, there is many different similarities, but again, I cannot speak to those situations. I can speak to this situation here. And what I can say is that the actions are definitely, that's what it is. But I need to, on Kurt's statement, I need to add further than that it's not just the actions of Sullivan-Clinton campaign.
Right.
We need to understand who told them to do this. They didn't come there on their own and say, I'm going to go do this. It was an action that was decided by who? This country to do this. So this is why, that's what it was. That it wasn't just Sullivan-Clinton. It needs to be stated that it wasn't, they were just the ones that was there. It was we know is that the colonies at that time that had told them to do that. So in order for that, it would be, yes, it does fall under that to me. But I would not speak to the other situations that I can do the comparisons, but I feel that would be up to you to do those. Yes.
Yeah, I think there are different aspects, I guess I would say. I mean, we tend to look at history through the lenses of the present and the recent past that we were familiar with. I don't think the kind of mechanized warfare that develops, especially in the 20th century, is so much more capable of wiping out many, many peoples than anything that came previously. It's not clear that there's necessarily a direct comparison that's available. I think the other point that's really important was Steve's emphasis on the fact, in some of those images of relationships, or was this Kurt? Now I forgot. Is that while the settlers need Native people to help them survive, the relationships are actually pretty good. It's only when they become significantly more powerful and can exercise the level of coercion that they couldn't previously that things begin to change in much for the worse in that regard. But again, if you look at patterns of relationships between the Haudenosaunee and the French and the English, the British, up until the Revolutionary War, I mean, in many ways, the colonists were dependent upon the military capabilities of the Haudenosaunee. So they're not about to go off and, systematically try to wipe out everybody because they need them. I think certainly with Sullivan-Clinton, that was an effort to just eradicate people. But after that, again, things get a little bit more complicated. So when there's the threat of the old Northwest, the Miamis and the Shawnees and so forth entering war in the 1790s, and George Washington is really worried. So he gets, Brant and Fish Carrier and others to go out and try and negotiate a peace. So again, they're not about to try and destroy certainly those leaders as long as they need them. So I think there are differences for those sorts of historical reasons, I would say. But certainly there are elements that, they want to completely wipe people out. And then after that, by the mid-19th century, with Manifest Destiny and so forth, it's, kill the Indian to save the man, so to speak. And into the late 19th and early 20th century as well. Everybody has to be totally assimilated. You've got to take their language away, send them to boarding school, and make them, members of the dominant society and its principles. I think by that point, interestingly enough, again, comparatively, most Haudenosaunee were sufficiently skilled at survivance against those kinds of pressures that they were able to withstand them more effectively than some other native people who had come into contact with colonial settlement processes much more recently. In the plains, in the far west, and so forth, in California, where there was a great deal of systematic genocide against people who had very little experience with these increasingly powerful, settlers and their military capabilities.
Thank you.
Maybe one or two more.
Yes, I'm interested in hearing more about the Gayogohó community in the Six Nations Reserve in Ontario. How is it doing today, and its viability and its current life? Whatever you think is most important to say.
The Six Nations Reserve and where we're at, it's a vibrant place. It's where I grew up. It's how do I say this? It's overpopulated. It's overpopulated. You can't drink the water in Six Nations. We have social problems that would make your hair stand up. But the people that live there are strong, resilient people. The people from Six Nations are probably the strongest people that I've ever come across. They're a tough breed. The people from Six Nations, they have a name for ourselves there. We call ourselves, so I think somebody had mentioned it here. We call ourselves Gayogohó. What that means is survivors. We don't call ourselves that. That's the way that we portray ourselves. That's the way it is. That place is Six Nations is, for all its problems, it's the can I say what's Six Nations? Six Nations is the epicenter of culture. It's the epicenter of language. It's the epicenter of. It's the stronghold of what we have still, of our people, of our language, of our culture, of anything else. So, and it's a vibrant place where young people are learning their language. It's a vibrant place where where our songs are still sung. It's a vibrant place where our dances are being held. Six Nations is a place where we moved everything for safety, so that it wouldn't be destroyed with everything else. Six Nations is there. It's Six Nations is full of people that should be right here. Six Nations is good. That's what I'm gonna say. Six Nations is good.
Nice.
Yeah.
All right, mindful of time, so we'll take one more from Larry, and then that'll be it.
Thank you so much for being here, Kurt and Stephen. We read your book in our group, and we so appreciate the chance to hear from you in person. Clinton Sullivan, such a painful memory, I'm sure, and I think it's just. I think on all sides we forget. We have this glorification of the revolution and the war for independence, and we just forget that it was a war, and that people died, and this genocide, all this horrible stuff. But what I want to just touch on is that Clinton Sullivan was a response, and you mentioned it briefly, but people in Cherry Valley, people in the Wyoming Valley, people in the Mohawk Valley were also victims of having of murder, of having their houses burned, having their crops burned, of displacement, of having to move someplace else, and of loss, and the Patriots the Americans were responding to that, and it was, in the end, unsuccessful because it just aggravated the situation, and it did not stop the raids, but it was war, and when somebody hits you, you hit them back harder. So yeah, and I think we all carry the trauma through generations. So, what do you think?
Who won?
There's no.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. There's no winner.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay.
I have a question. What can we do to make everything better? What personally can we do? I know the history books are not correct. When I went to school, the history books, were on the side of American people, not on the side of Native Americans. Is there something? Do we need to read? Do we need to study and write letters? I mean, what is there?
Educate yourself. Education. I think that you've said things. Something that jumped right out is you understand that what you learned in school wasn't wasn't right. You know that there's bias on it. You know that there's a slant on it. And this is what I say: educate yourself. I get this question a lot. What can we do? What can we do? What can we do? I try to think about what the people before me, what they would say, how they would answer this. It's a very tough question and a tough way to go. I try to think about the people that had taught me this, my grandmother, my uncles, the way that they would say, if they were here, if they would say, I try to think about what their answer would be. And I'll say it what they were going to say, but you're not going to like it. Nobody's going to like what the answer is, what it was going to say. I try to think about what those people, what they would say. What can we do to make this better? What can we do our part? And I can just hear Muffmitch right now. I can hear just Jake Thomas right now, what he would say. You know what he would say? And I don't take this, that I'm not saying this in a bad way. He would say, go home. That's what he would say. That's what can be done to help. But we understand that that can't happen. We're all in this together. So that's why I would choose education, to educate yourself, to educate in a way that, because we realize we're all in this together now. We're all in this together. So I think that educating yourselves and sharing education of what you know, because it's still not mainstream. They're still not teaching the proper things in school. So like, do what you can with that, educate yourselves and share it with one another so that we can't change the past, but what we can do is we can move together in the future, because we're in this together now. And we need to understand, and we need to, if we can understand the past and look forward together, I think that's really important, is to just have an understanding of together now. Because up to now, we haven't really been in the picture. We've been looked at as a historical, we're looked at as a past tense, we're looked at, every time we're spoken of the Cayuga people were here. The Cayuga people did these things. There's nothing that talks about us today. And maybe that can be one thing that you can do. When you speak about our people, don't speak of us in a historical context. Speak of us as today, and maybe change the idea of, maybe speak of a future for Gayogohó people as well. I think that would be a really good thing, a good positive. One thing that you can do personally and other people here, I think that's a good thing. Like, just to don't look at us as we're not a history lesson. We're not a history lesson. We're today, and we're even further than that. We're looking to have a future here in our homelands. So that's one thing that we can do together.
Thank you, Stephen.